Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our first event of the 2024 Fall Author Series. My name is Kelly Marble. I work on our marketing team here. And so to start out, I just have a few housekeeping things. One, it's Library Card Sign-Up Month. So if you don't yet have a library card, it's easy to sign up. All you need is a photo ID and proof of address. Second, all of you should have a question card on your seat. If you have any questions for Shawntelle, you can fill that out, and Aaron and Dennis will be walking around picking those up throughout and bringing them up here to me on stage. Beaverdale Books is set up right over here, and you can get a copy of The Fallen Fruit from Hunter, and Shawntelle will be signing directly following the program. Okay, and now to introduce our author. Shawntelle Madison is a Des Moines native and a New York Times best-selling author of more than 15 science fiction, romance, and fantasy books. Her latest novel, The Fallen Fruit, is a genre-bending family saga that follows a Black family that for 2 centuries has been cursed with the gift of time travel. In each generation, one family member will fall through time with no guarantee of safe return, haunting those left behind. In a review, Kirkus called the book a crafty, page-turning spin and compared it favorably to Octavia Butler's Kindred, as well as The Time Traveler's Wife and the works of Ray Bradbury. Join me in welcoming Shawntelle to the stage. So since you are originally from Des Moines, welcome home, welcome back. How's it being back?
Okay, I am so happy to be back in town, just driving past places that I recognize, wanting to eat food that I miss so much, passing bebops and thinking, could I just pull over a little bit and just get like one burger, before I head off in town. So I've loved being back in town. It's nice seeing familiar faces and seeing family.
Yeah, and you grew up going to the Des Moines Public Library System, the old downtown library on the river.
Yes, I remember fondly so many of the branches, and I know a lot of them have been torn down and changed, but I still have those positive memories of visiting the library and kind of like the programs and everything and having a really good time. So it's really wonderful. It's almost like a full circle moment to go back to the library and then relive those memories.
So the book just came out on Tuesday, so happy publication week.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much.
So I know not many people have gotten a chance to read The Fallen Fruit, so I thought about starting out with what's your little elevator pitch for your book or?
Yeah, I usually tell people it's Kindred meets the Time Traveler's Wife, but not everybody knows what Kindred or the Time Traveler's Wife is. So I would say in a way, if you imagined that your family had the curse of time travel, and at any moment, if one of those family members was born from a male in the family, so say your uncle had 3 children, well, potentially one of those children could fall back in time at any time. But it pretty much means anybody, meaning say someone has 10 children, and back in them days, folks had a lot of children. And so pretty much every single male from those 10 children, one of their children could fall back in time. So as you can imagine, that would be devastating to a family and very traumatic. And so in particular for the book, I tell folks it's basically a time travel curse for an entire family that affects them over generations.
I think Aaron's going to switch out your microphone. It seems to be cutting out a little bit. Okay. So when thinking about researching a book, I loved all of the historical periods we got to see throughout it. I know you did a lot of genealogy, you did a lot of deep diving research, spending time in libraries. Tell us about what that process was like, what kind of inspired the book in the first place.
Oh my gosh. Oh, wow. Um, I would say the inspiration for this book is based off of me doing genealogy for my family. I've been doing it for over 10 years now, and it's been enlightening, frightening, so many stories. I pretty much started out with both sides from my mother and my father's side and kind of discovered about our local history here in Iowa as coal miners on both sides of the family. And so I have family that came out of Buxton, came out of Zooksburg, came out of Colfax. And a lot of those folks, they were recruited by the mining companies. So whenever there was a strike, it was quite convenient to get folks to actually work for lower wages. And that's how my family from Virginia and various other places in the South actually ended up here in Iowa. They were recruited for coal mining jobs. And so when I dug deeper on my mother's side, I actually found, okay, they came out of Virginia, but when I dug further, I actually went back all the way to Charlottesville, Virginia specifically. And in Charlottesville, I discovered all the way back to the American Revolutionary period, my 6th great grandmother named Amy Bowles Farrow. She actually was a formerly enslaved woman pre-American Revolution. And after she became free, she saved up her money and she ended up buying hundreds of acres of land in Charlottesville post-American Revolution. And I gotta tell y'all, for a Black woman to be able to buy that much land during that time period is very, very rare. And during that time, she bought it from a merchant, Nicholas Lewis, and during the time, she was surrounded by plantations. So during that time, probably a little bit later, we're talking about Samuel Carr's Dunlora, Thomas Jefferson's Monticello. So a lot of those big names that you've read about in history often had plantations in the Charlottesville area. So it was definitely an area with a rich history. And one of Amy's children, Zachariah Bowles, actually ended up marrying Critta Hemmings, who was Sally Hemings' sister. So there's a lot of interpersonal relationships and things going on there that I found so fascinating. So when I looked at Amy's story, I looked at how she bought that land that eventually became Free State over time. I found their lives so fascinating. I was like, how did they survive? How did they make a living with the Virginia slave codes and everything? So when she bought this land, slavery was still going on when she actually bought this land. So there was still the fear of becoming enslaved for her children and for everyone else in the area. And so when I took a look at Amy's story, The Land, I write speculative fiction, which means I make up stuff for a living. And so I asked myself the question, what more could I do to torture my characters? And at that point, I threw in time travel. So obviously Amy's story is amazing as it is, but I wanted to add a little bit of a twist to it. So I added in the time travel curse, and that's how the story began. Now the research, y'all, there was too much research to do. So specifically in the book, we're dealing with over 5 time periods. So you're looking at 1750, the 1780s, a little bit post-American Revolution, the 1814s, a little bit after the 1812 war. We're going in now to next the 1910s, the 1920s, the 1940s, and then I have the 1960s. So can you imagine taking a protagonist in various parts, sticking them there, and bringing the reader into that moment? I have to do research to actually ground you in so that you actually feel like you're following around a woman who is attending Howard University in the 1920s and seeing what her life is like. And that requires sitting in front of a computer, reading papers for long periods of time, and asking myself, when am I going to eat? When am I going to breathe? That kind of thing. But I call it the research black hole, and it was very fulfilling because every time I explored something new, I learned something that I didn't even bring to the page. And I won't go into some of the cool things that I learned, but I will say that it was in terms of the book, I would say was probably 70% research, and then the rest was writing. I actually had to do research in order to actually put words on the page.
What would you say was your favorite kind of fun fact you picked up along all of those little research black holes?
Yeah, one of the things I really wanted to dive in, so no spoilers, one of my characters, you know, it does say in the back blurb that one of my characters does end up heading to the battlefield, and that character was Luke Bridge. So when I mean the battlefield, I mean the American Revolutionary War. And so in order to actually bring that to life, I looked at one of my distant ancestors on my mother's side, and his name was Shadrach Battles. And Shadrach Battles was actually a black man that participated in the American Revolutionary War. And what was cool is I thought to myself as I researched him and a lot of the other black soldiers, I was like, I did not learn this in school. I did not learn what it was like for these gentlemen to actually have to enlist, what it was like for them to be at the, go through their training, what was it like to be at the different wars and things. And so one of the most things that I found enriching was actually taking a look at Shadrach Battles' journey. He actually is on the Valley Forge muster rolls. Now, what do I mean by Valley Forge? If you remember George Washington, and after the battles, he ended up setting up camp at Valley Forge where a lot of people, there was a winter time, a lot of people got sick and some folks died. Shadrach actually survived, but if you look at his muster roll, you actually see that he got sick too. And then after that, he actually continued to serve, and then he actually got out of being enlisted. So that was one of my favorite things, was actually following one of my ancestors' journey, but then in turn, I learned more about the American Revolutionary War and learned little tidbits of facts like how both the white and the black soldiers were actually all together. It was integrated. So at the camp at Valley Forge, they were building structures together. They were sleeping right next to each other. And when folks got sick, they were all together. So that was a fact that I never learned, and it was absolutely amazing to explore that through my ancestor and then bring that on the page.
That's awesome. And so you took all of that research and then you added a little bit of magic. Like, you are a speculative fiction writer. And so I was curious, what is it about adding a little bit of magic to our world and history that gets you excited to write? I know you've done it with a lot of your series and this book. And so I'd just love to know what that kind of gets you excited about writing.
I love speculative fiction because it is that opportunity for us to go past the mundane. When you think about it, we just live our everyday lives, but we kind of use magic as a way to get past what we live every day. And we can imagine fairies, or we can imagine werewolves or vampires. We can watch Marvel movies. We can see Superman flying through the air. We can go beyond what we live every day and see something more. So obviously, like I said earlier, I could have written about Amy's life and her children, but for me, tapping into something speculative gives me an opportunity to frame the story in a different way past what we would normally see every day. So it actually gets me excited to think those what-if questions.
Yeah. And so then time travel specifically. There are so many logistics to time travel. I know you are a developer for your day job. And so how did you, I loved in the front cover, the reading the 4 rules of the time travel. How did you approach writing a time travel book? What were the logistics that went into that? Because it's just, time travel can make your head hurt sometimes.
That is literally correct right there, head hurt. So I got about 300 or so pages into writing the book, and the cognitive load became ridiculous. Meaning, how do I hold multiple time periods, people jumping forward and back in time, and I have to hold it all up in here? Now, I do have a lot of notes. I was tracking people's dates and stuff, initially by hand, first mistake. And so by tracking all that in my head, it reached a point to where there were too many people, there were too many things going on, people going back into the past, to where it actually physically hurt. There were multiple times where I had to actually walk away from the page and be like, you know what? I need a second to reorganize because I don't remember where Jane came from. I don't know what she's doing. I don't know where it's going. And since I'm the one steering the ship, I need to actually know what's going on. And so I ended up using a lot of tools to actually help me keep track of my research, creating a bibliography. But I came up with so many facts that I kind of just had to kind of compile and keep them together. And one of the tools I use that I absolutely love and recommend to any writer is called Aeon Timeline. So what Aeon Timeline does is it's a way to track, and you don't even have to also use it for writing, you can also use it in a business sense as well. But Aeon Timeline allowed me to have all of these cast of characters, what were their birth dates, what were the relationships between my characters, who's the mom, who's the dad, who's uncles, and in different scenes, who's in that particular scene, what is their age. If they fall back in time, their age is gonna stay the same, but their birth date is gonna change. So there was so much for me to track, and it was actually easier for me to use software to actually do the heavy lifting, so I wasn't trying to hurt myself to actually finish this book. So I will definitely say it was using my resources as a developer, thinking to myself, how do I organize facts and information so that I can retrieve it later as I'm editing? Because, oh my goodness, y'all, having my copy editors say to me, okay, so we have people showing up at Wintecock Creek, and how do they get from A to B? Do you have a map of where you reference Wintecock Creek? And I was just like, girl, that's a map from 1766. I'm gonna get back to you, I'm gonna find that. But the sheer amount of information in the past of getting people from A to B, another thing that I was gonna point out is, of course, in the past, the one thing we don't realize is we look at the United States and we see all the counties as they are. But counties have changed over the centuries. So one place that could be Polk could have been something in the past. So if I'm trying to track all that, I also have to track changes in locations, changes in maps. So it was painful sometimes.
And so with all these storylines in the book, there was sometimes some love stories, some like kind of people not understanding what was happening, because who would think of time travel in the 1700s? And so do you have a favorite storyline that you liked writing? I know it's like picking your children,
Yes,
but.
yes. For me, the most favorite storyline was the American Revolution. I had so much fun with Sabrina's part, and actually Sabrina's part, a little tidbit, that was actually the first part that I started to write. She spoke to me first. She's not first in the book. She comes out a bit later, but I'm not gonna, no spoilers, but there was something about her journey in terms of being a woman, living on the farm, wanting more out of her life than just living there. She wanted to be a seamstress. And of course, she falls in love and she has to make choices and all that kind of stuff. But her life, the simplicity of her life, her love of embroidery, I know it sounds mundane, but it was nice to just be in her head and to fall in love and to just kind of have that yearning that she had. I really loved that.
And so I know you mentioned you're using your work as a developer with organizing your story. How did it also help with like the editing process? I know it's also a creative field, but.
I will say in terms of, for me personally, the difference between when I edit versus when I develop or when I write is actually it's tapping into the same creative process as writing code. So actually it's harder for me to do both. So it's harder for me to be like code all day and then suddenly I'm gonna write. I'm actually tapping from the same creative well. So it's actually really hard for me to actually code and then write. But one thing that I got from coding is meticulously note-taking, you know, whether you're tracking a bug or, you know, you're trying to debug something. For me, it's the same way, where I'm sitting there and thinking to myself, oh, I've got paragraphs, I've got sentences. There's something wrong with this one line of code or this one sentence. What can I do to optimize it? Or as I say, edit it. And so I kind of treated it the same way, where I am constantly assuming that something could be flawed and how can I actually make it better so that the reader actually has a good experience when they read that. So in terms of editing, I tend to be meticulous. What I mean by that is whenever I touched a scene or a chapter, I reminded myself. I would set a mark saying, okay, Tuesday you touched this scene and you did this. Because that way, like remember I said earlier, I had a lot of cognitive load in tracking when people time travel. So to actually kind of help myself, be like, okay, did I remember I was supposed to have Bob go back here and do this? Did I remember to do that? By actually setting the notes for myself and reminding myself what I did, I didn't have to worry about that. I didn't have to question whether I actually edited a scene or I actually made a change that I was supposed to do in my editorial notes. It was all there for me to see that I specifically did a task.
That's much more organized than I think I will ever be in my life, but I love it. So I know you also recently got an MFA, so you've published a lot of books. How has your writing process changed or evolved with getting your MFA? How has it changed?
Oh my gosh. One of the things that I had wanted to do a couple years ago is, if you remember that song by Sierra, Level Up. I told myself, okay, I have written professionally for over 10 years now. I have been published, I have a literary agent, but in any career that we're in, we have to ask ourselves, can we do more? Can we grow? And so for me, growing was actually getting a master's, another one. I already have a master's in tech, but I asked myself, okay, what can I do to make my career more fulfilling? How can I challenge myself by torturing myself with more schoolwork when I already have college and high school age kids having to read a book, and I still had writing deadlines, even though I had to do, all the assignments to complete my MFA. And most people complete their MFA in maybe like 2 years. It actually took me 4 to 5 to actually finish because I was taking like 1 or 2 classes a semester. A couple times I only could take 1 because I had deadlines and things to do. But in terms of getting my master's in writing, it really challenged me to read books that I wouldn't read before. It challenged me to be like, okay, I primarily read genre fiction, sci-fi, romance, thrillers, horrors. I am game. But to be challenged to read perhaps something that's a little bit more literary, something that could be beyond what I would read before, that is actually a growth opportunity for me. That was an opportunity for me to do assignments and to actually say to myself, how can I grow? What can I do if I'm doing this assignment? Okay, I understand writing, but what can I do better for myself so that if my career professionally is writing and developing, then how can I be a better writer? Because, I'm in the tech field. I will go to conferences and I will learn a new programming language. I will learn new tools and stuff. But why can't I also get a degree in writing so I can be a better writer? So that's why I got my MFA.
Makes a lot of sense. And also, sounds like a lot of fun, getting to read a bunch of books. Do you have a favorite book you read during your MFA? Or?
Yes, I would say one of my favorite classes was the monster fiction class. I took a class about writing fiction with monsters. And so one of the favorite books that I read, and of course I'm spacing, When a Monster Calls. That book to me, so that's I believe it's middle grade. And one of the things that I love is I had seen the movie. So When a Monster Calls was actually made into a movie. But for me I had never actually sat down and analyzed why the book worked, why the storyline was so strong. It's about a little boy who has lost a family member and he's coping with it. And a monster shows up and he goes through this journey of acceptance, and I never really critically analyzed it. So I really loved that opportunity to go deeper with fiction that I wouldn't have done before.
And so how do you think your MFA influenced The Fallen Fruit, or your writing of The Fallen Fruit?
Yeah, so much. Actually, one of the scenes in this book is still the same. It was actually part of an assignment for my MFA. And it was one of those questions where you go deeper, you analyze something, you analyze people, a situation. And after I wrote it, I was just like, whoa, I'd like to come back to this person. I'd like to come back to these people. So it actually ended up as a scene in the book. And critically analyzing other fiction gave me an opportunity as I constructed this book to say, okay, I want to write a bigger book. I want to write a book where I want these characters to go deeper in these types of ways. So going through my program gave me an opportunity to kind of slow down, kind of cook the gumbo, kind of stir the pot slowly and see what actually unfolds. So going through the program definitely gave me an opportunity to have a new perspective in terms of writing. Like, I still had the writing perspective, but it's kind of like turning slightly to the left and seeing it in a new and actually different way.
So if any of you do have questions for Shawntelle, Erin and Dennis can take them too. And we can keep chatting, figuring out what... Turned off my own mic. But so with this book specifically, you switched genres. So you've been writing some urban fantasy, some kind of cozy fantasy in a little bit of a way. And so what inspired you to switch from those genres to then speculative historical fiction more?
That is a really good question, because before that, my first book was published. Coveted was about a werewolf with OCD, which is so far away from this. It's so far away from this. Definitely more humorous, definitely a different tone. You're probably gonna recognize the voice if you've read my other work. You're also gonna recognize the humor in some of the places, but I definitely, it's much more of a different book than what I wrote before. But in terms of the jump, so what ended up happening is back in 2018, I was with one of my good friends. She's a contemporary romance author named Jessica Scott. And so Jess and I were kind of at a point in our careers where we were looking at what type of story we wanted to write. Did we want to continue writing romance? Did we want to maybe go into women's fiction? What did we want to do with our careers? And so at that point, Jess kind of offhand says, you should write a Southern fiction book about a family of werewolves and their legacy and drama over time. And I was like, yeah, I could potentially do that. But over time, over the years, I kind of asked myself, what could I do? How could I go deeper in terms of a story where I go beyond coveted or urban fantasy and actually explore some other themes that I actually haven't touched before, such as African American history and things like that. So fast forward to 2021, I had already started to dabble in historical fiction at that point. My agent was good about it. He's like, sure, let's see what direction this goes in. And then I gave him the pitch for The Fallen Fruit, and he said, I hope you started writing that already, because I want it now. So it was pretty much a change in wanting to see what I can do beyond. For me, it's about the story. It's not exactly about a great big plot, but what kind of story, what kind of characters, what kind of message can I bring out, that kind of thing.
Okay, so we have a few questions. So with the location changes, did you have to contend with geographic change based on rivers redirecting, shifting, etc.?
Yeah. I cannot tell you how many times, do not trust Google Maps for ancient history. The amount of times rivers have been redistributed, moved, I can't even count. I literally had to use, there was this tool that I found, and I forgot, it's a government website, where I could see how at least counties evolved in Virginia itself, where you could see counties over the decades being added. That helped, but that doesn't get you down to the micro level where there was a creek here, and then suddenly there was a creek there. So what I had to do was I had to take the old map and then superimpose it on modern day. Because obviously, sometimes I had to ask the question to myself, okay, well, people had to take a boat ride upriver. I have to actually say how many days it took for them to go upriver. And if I use a modern day map, I could probably figure that out. But now I'm dealing with a 1766 map with a creek that no longer exists. I no longer know whether it's uphill, downhill anymore. So to answer that question, it was hard. It was very hard. I had to be meticulous in tracking information.
And then do you have any more reading recommendations from your that you read during your MFA?
Oh my gosh, how much time y'all got? Yeah, I love it. I am one of those people that when I read, a lot of the stuff that was in the program was outside of what I would normally read. But if I could give recommendations within or outside of the program, there were a couple of things. I actually did take a Neil Gaiman class, so I got a chance to read a bunch of his book, The Graveyard Book, Neverwhere. I got a chance to read it again and actually critically analyze it, and I cheated a couple times by actually watching the show as I read it. Yeah, don't watch the show, y'all. It was painful. But the Neil Gaiman class, I absolutely loved exploring some of his works that I've read some of his work before. His favorite work of mine is The American Gods. That was actually made into a show. I really loved American Gods. But yeah, I would say out of my MFA program, I really enjoyed the Neil Gaiman books, and I could recommend other books that I read outside of the program. But yeah, I would say in my MFA, I loved Neil Gaiman.
That's a good recommendation. So you mentioned some of your writing friends. What role does the writing community play in your life and creative process? Do you work with critique partners?
I have had, so I guess I should start back at the beginning. So I started writing in 2008. And what ended up happening is I was at a play group with other moms. So the kids are running around, screaming, doing their thing. And another mom, who is still my best friend and critique partner, she's standing beside me and she's like, you know what? I'm gonna go back into writing. And at that time I had been dabbling. I had loved paranormal romance, so I was working on paranormal romance. And she's like, you know what? We should, get serious about this, because before she had written professionally. And I was just kind of dabbling and trying to figure things out. So of course, I sent her my manuscript and it was a hot mess, y'all. It was a hot mess, but I was a beginner. So what I ended up doing is I joined a professional organization, Romance Writers of America, and I gotta tell y'all, romance writers, in terms of business, in terms of craft, we do not play. I learned so much from romance writers. And so from that point, in terms of community, I learned so much from more experienced romance writers in terms of saying, okay, if this is your career path, you need to be making these decisions. Okay, if you're pitching your book to publishers, I want you to actually change your pitch in this way so you're actually selling yourself. So before I was just talking about the book. I wasn't trying to sell the book. Those are some of the things that I learned from actually joining professional organizations. So I've joined things like SIFWA, that's the sci-fi fantasy, horror writers organizations. So I've given myself an opportunity to really join organizations, learn more about the writing craft, but also over that journey and going to conferences, I met a lot of my peers. I met a lot of people that I got to fangirl over, and then later I become their friend. I still remember the time where I met, you may not know her, Beverly Jenkins, or yes, when I met Miss Bev the first time, yeah. Being awe-inspired by a lot of these great writers, and so I really grew by actually seeing how those other folks did their thing and put their words on the page.
So in relation to the fallen fruit, what was the inspiration to keep all of the timelines in the past rather than weaving in a present day timeline?
Yeah, one of my earliest decisions for this book that I said to myself was I actually did not want present day. There are some historical fictions that are done really, really well where you have a contemporary thread and then you have a historical thread. But I kind of made my decision early on that I wanted my contemporary, modern day protagonist to actually be in the 1960s. And that actually gave me an opportunity as an author to really dive in and say, what was the perspective of a Black woman who was a sci-fi nerd in the 1960s? I know what it was like for me growing up in the 80s as a sci-fi nerd, watching Dune, falling in love with that, and seeing all the movies, reading Heinlein and Asimov. But when I chose, instead of a modern thread, I really wanted to see what would it be like for a modern history professor in the 1960s who actually, followed the freedom riders around, actually was a professor at Tennessee State University. What was her life like? What was it like for her to grow up and actually enjoy those types of stories? So yeah, I wanted to see a nerd in the 60s.
And so you talked a lot about all of your research into your family's past. If someone wanted to kind of dive into their family's history and past, where would you recommend they start?
I would say first things first. The temptation will be go to like 23andMe, Ancestry.com. Sure, go ahead and take the DNA test. That way you get it started, get it done and over with, because actually that will be valuable later. But step one, in my opinion, is you need to talk to your elders. If you think to yourself, these are the folks who actually have the tea on the family secrets, all the things that going on, uncle, auntie, grandma, that they was doing, I got a lot of tea when I dug in. But sometimes you learn later, and as a practical example, I actually found out on my mom's side that I have a very distant cousin who is in her 90s. And she actually knew a lot of my relatives who were farther back on the family tree. She had met these people. She actually knew some of the tea that is not in any of the census records or anything like that. Property records, she had the tea. So tip number one, talk to your elders. Write down their stories. See what information they have. And then you can move over to the fun stuff on Ancestry and build your trees. But if you think about it, we're not always going to have our elders with us. So you need to take that opportunity to talk to them now, get that story down, because the fact is, majority of the time, folks want to tell me. They want to tell me the tea. So go out and talk to your elders.
And so as a science fiction fantasy nerd, is there a subgenre of science fiction or fantasy that you want to explore in the future that you haven't yet? And do you have any favorite science fiction or fantasy authors to recommend?
Well, I mean, of course, I got to recommend Octavia Butler. Kindred, Parable of a Sower. Kindred was made into a Hulu show. So she was actually the first Black sci-fi writer that I encountered. So I would say I would definitely recommend Octavia. And then, of course, N.K. Jemisin. Tomi Adeyemi. There's so many folks right now who are writing really great science fiction, but I would say Octavia was the one that I encountered as a teenager, sitting on the shelf. She was sitting there with Asimov and Heinlein, and I was like, yes, as a Black girl, I could write sci-fi. Now, if I could ever tackle something someday, and I know it would be a bit harder for me, I would love to do hard sci-fi someday, but someday, I will say that. I would love to nerd out, but I know when in tackling historical fiction research, hard sci-fi, you still have to put in the work. Because the system, whether the technology, everything, it has to make sense. And you actually have to have the kind of mindset to come up with the ideas to do that. And for me right now, that's not exactly a muscle that I really exercised a lot often. But never say never. It's all about learning and tackling and see what more I can do.
So when you're writing, do you handwrite or type your drafts? This person says, hoping for a fountain pen as an answer.
Okay, so I gotta say, sometimes actually I do. I actually have a notebook. As a matter of fact, I have multiple notebooks where I actually have handwritten a scene or an opening or lines that I'm gonna transfer into the computer. So actually, yes, and sadly, no, it's not a fountain pen. Okay, I should explain. My undergrad was in math. So if you're sitting there in college, back in the day, the professor's just going from one side of the chalkboard to the other. And all I did was use a mechanical pencil to just write all of that hot mess garbage that I would never ever use. Yeah, I have not used anything from Calc 3 ever. But after that point, I always loved mechanical pencils. I don't like pens, for me personally, because I tend to, after I write out a sentence, my brain will say to me, okay, you could keep going, but you could tweak that sentence. You could erase that word real fast, and you could put something a little better in there. And so I gave myself permission to go by pencil, and then that way I can draw and erase as I feel free, because I grew up in the era of typewriters where you type and then you have to white out. No, give me an eraser. Let me do pencil. So I do stuff by hand, and I have dictated before, but the fastest way that I have to actually complete a book is just typing it out.
And so while writing The Fallen Fruit, were you ever stuck while writing, or did it just reveal itself as you went? If you had a block, what was the breakthrough?
Oh my gosh, so many times blocked where I'm sitting there, I'm running into like the grandfather paradox with time travel. I'm running into so many issues where I have to untangle threads. That's one of the hardest parts of time travel, is when you start to weave things together, you weave things too tightly, and then it's harder to introduce things later down the line. So like I said, it was the note taking, but so one of the situations, I can't say it because it's a spoiler, but I would say when I encounter what I would call a block, I wouldn't even call it writer's block. I would just say I wrote myself into a hole. I have to dig myself back out. When I tend to do that, I found that over the 10 years that I was like, oh my gosh, I keep forgetting the method that I used to dig myself out of a hole. So I actually wrote down the method that I used to get out of the hole. I stuck it up on the wall of my office, and it is sitting there like, if you get stuck, do these steps. And the first step is, anytime when you get stuck, the tip that was most important for me was I don't have enough information. Meaning that I wrote myself into a hole, but I didn't set up things enough, reaching that point to where I would have that aha moment. So it's like, oh, I didn't know that the key was over there, or I didn't know that he actually left the room, as example, a bit earlier. So whenever I have writer's block or I write myself into a hole, I have a cheat sheet.
Okay, and so this one I really love. What is your writing schedule like, since you also have another very complex job?
It's on and off. I have issues with eye strain and also headaches and migraines. So a lot of it is listening to my body. There are some days where where my characters are talking to me and I have to get the words out. But if I don't feel well, if I have a migraine, the day is over. So one of the first things I had to do in terms of like a writing schedule is like, know thyself. I have to acknowledge that, okay, today is not a writing day. Today is a sit and watch a Korean drama or sit and watch, anime. So I kind of have to be gentle with myself. So if I have a good day, then I am one of those people that I like to make sure I am doing like an 8 to 5, a regular work day. Because since I work from home as a developer, I'm a remote worker, the temptation to work too long, too many hours can hurt me. So I tend to be like, okay, we start at 8 or we start at 9, we do some of the business stuff, answering emails, that kind of thing, and then we sit down and I pre-plot. What I mean by that is I tend to be one of those people, I call it squirrel, where I will write a scene because it sounds funny and, ooh, I want to have my character do X, Y, Z, and it doesn't advance the plot. It doesn't show anything about the characters. It was just me having fun. So by actually me sitting down and saying, this is what I need to do today, this is how I carry this story forward, it gives me an opportunity to actually stay on track and finish things on time. Now, do I still enjoy my little have fun moments? Yes, they don't make it into the story, but yes, I have my moments where I have fun, but I go throughout the day. I tend to do 30-minute writing sprints. So I sit down, I get 30 minutes, then to protect my eyes, I have this software on Mac called Intermission, and after 30 minutes, it blackens my screen. So it's like, girl, you done, you're kicked off. And it says, when the chime rings, you get to work again. So I'm sitting there like, okay, fine, I'll go switch out the laundry, I'll go, touch grass, I'll do something else. And so for me, I'll go through and do those 30-minute sprints, I'll have my lunch, but a lot of the time, My peak time for me is in the morning. I kind of have that morning brain, and I was one of those kids where, as the world turns plays, and I think it's nap time. So afternoon time is a bit harder for me in terms of writing. I can still write, especially if I'm deadline. I will be up at midnight editing and writing if I'm on deadline. But otherwise, I will try to, from 8 to 12, have a writing schedule for normalcy.
Are your tech coworkers blown away that you are an author with an MFA, or is it kind of like a secret life you have outside of your job?
What ends up happening, what is amazing is I tend to not tell people, but then they Google me, and then I can't hide it anymore. So I was living in a previous neighborhood, and one of my neighbors was like, wait a minute, I saw your book in, back in the day at Borders. Wait, you didn't tell me that you were a writer and all that kind of stuff. And I was just like, yeah, it's my other job. Or you'll have somebody be like, wait, you write romance? I read your, oh girl, they happened in that one scene? Yeah, that kind of thing. And so I try to have it be part of my, like Superman versus Clark Kent other career, but most of the time people figure it out. So, and a lot of my writers, my friends in the tech space, they're actually writers too. So yeah, so we roll in packs, but yeah, I tend to not broadcast it, but most folks usually figure it out.
And so you are originally from Iowa, the Midwest. You still live in St. Louis. Do you have any plans to set stories in Iowa or Missouri in the future?
Yes, I actually would love to. One of the things that in doing genealogy is I learned so much about Buxton and how on my mother and my father's side, we had folks who actually lived in Buxton. So I would love to explore some more of the history, especially in terms of exploring how my ancestors were recruited as coal miners. What was their life like? What was it like for them to go from post-slavery during the Reconstruction period? What was it actually like for them to build a new life in the Midwest in such a new and different place? So I would love to explore that, and whether it's historical fiction or even an urban fantasy set in Iowa, something fun, I would definitely love to tap into Iowa.
I love that. So then when you're writing, what music do you listen to while you write, or are you a person who writes in silence?
In the beginning, I actually wrote in silence. Since I have ADHD, I'm easily distractible. But what I found is when I wrote in silence, it was kind of harder to get into the mood. What I mean by that is if I am writing an action scene, I found that I would often listen to like soundtracks of movies where things are happening. Of course, John Williams, you've probably heard a lot of these composers, they come up with great pieces, and it actually got me in the mood for the moment. So if I'm writing something dark or horror, I listen to something a little bit dark. And if I'm writing romance, I want something fun or bubbly or angst. And so for me now, beginning writer, silence, now I always listen to music. It is a way to actually have a soundtrack for me. And actually, in the book club guide for The Fallen Fruit, you can check it out online. I actually have a playlist on one of the pages in the book club guide where you can actually see the music that I listened to while I was writing The Fallen Fruit. So, yeah.
That's a fun idea to have a playlist for the book. I love that. So you mentioned kind of starting writing with your mom friends. How old was that when you first got interested in being a writer, or was it before that?
It was before that. I was one of those kids. My mom still has this little booklet. Yes, it was one of my cousins. I had this little booklet of animals and giraffes, and my teacher was like, wow, Shawntelle, just, she's so creative. And so that was kind of like the seed. And I started writing stories, middle grade, stuff like that. Really bad fan fiction, really bad sci-fi. And then what ended up happening is I really didn't move forward with that. I really didn't see where that went. And then, of course, I went to college. I got a degree in a tech space. And so I really wasn't reading or writing as much. I mean, I was still reading sci-fi and stuff, but I really wasn't writing. So, of course, fast forward to the point where most people would think I've got like toddlers. My daughter in 2008, she was 1. So I literally had this child in diapers crawling all over me as I'm trying to write paranormal romance, as I'm trying to think, ooh, happy people falling in love, and oh wow, your diaper needs to be changed. There was definitely, but in the beginning though, there was a point where I felt free. There was none of this writing for publication. It was writing for the joy of it. And so, yes, I would say I didn't really write professionally and think of terms of completing stories until my children were really, really small.
I think this one is a good one to end on. If there's one message or theme from The Fallen Fruit that you would want to stick with your readers, what would you hope that would be?
Hope and resilience. A lot of the times in doing genealogy, one of the things that I found, besides like the 1870 wall, and what I mean by the 1870 wall is for African Americans, you know, the emancipation happened in the 1860s. Not everybody was freed when the emancipation happened, but you try to find your ancestors and sometimes you run into a dead end. You don't learn about what happened to them. You don't learn about their lives. And one of the things in having hope is you hope that they did well. You hope that their lives were fulfilling and that they were happy. And giving me a chance in doing genealogy and then bringing the bridges to life, it was a way for me to tap into my ancestors and imagine what their lives was like and think to, you know, even though it was hard back then, they were happy, they fell in love, they had hope for the future.